It's the late 90s and life is just perfect. I'm playing Mario 64, my knees and my back don't hurt, and every time Saved by the Bell comes on and Kelly Kapowski appears on the screen, I'm suddenly getting a tingling sensation in my underneath. It's like life couldn't possibly get any better. And then the commercials come on and this appears on my TV.
Hey, little buddy, want a ride?
Pikachu!
Yeah, whatever. I'll be right back.
Where can you catch all 150 Pokémon?
Got ya.
On your Game Boy, that's where. Pokémon for Game Boy is here. With both packs, you can catch them all. Games and systems sold separately.
What is this? Okay, alright, you've got me, I'll try it. And I was just hooked. For me, it was Pokemon Blue. My brother had Pokemon Red, and between the two of us, we were absolutely obsessed. We'd stay up all night playing, discovering new Pokemon, discovering new areas, and trying to figure out what we were supposed to do next. And there was just something about Pokemon that completely sucked you in. The music, the battles, the collecting, the items, beating Team Rocket. Also finding a new Pokemon and immediately deciding whether it was going to go into your rotation of 6 or sitting into the PC for eternity, never to be used again. And the replayability was insane. Who do I pick as my starter? Do I try and beat the game as quickly as possible? Do I actually try and catch them all? Do I break the game with Missing Note? Do I give myself unlimited rare candies or Master Balls? Is Mew actually hiding underneath that pickup truck? Is Misty secretly in love with me? Why isn't there a Mrs. Mime? And why does Weepinbell look like that? I mean, seriously, like who designed that thing? You know who designed that thing wanted to put something in something. You know that, right? But that's what Pokemon did. It gave you this enormous world to get lost in. And then it wasn't just a Game Boy anymore. The TV show hit our screens and became must-watch television. The trading cards were suddenly everywhere. Every kid wanted to be Ash, leaving Pallet Town with his Pikachu and setting off on the ultimate adventure. And we didn't question any of it. Nobody questioned why a 10-year-old could just leave home and start wandering around the country. Nobody questioned why children were allowed to capture wild animals and force them to fight each other. Nobody questioned why apparently nobody in this world needed to go to school. And stranger danger? Oh yeah, apparently that wasn't invented yet. It was the 90s. Everything was just cool. Pokemon wasn't just a game anymore. It had become the center of every kid's universe. So when Nintendo showed us this...
Today's assignment, photograph the elusive Pokemon. How do you do it? You're gonna be fast. You need a keen eye, the best equipment, and lightning-quick reflexes.
No, you don't. All you need is Pokemon Snap, the first Pokemon game for N64. Find them, frame them, and shoot. You can even bring your Snap cartridge to a participating Blockbuster Video and print out stickers of your favorites.
Doesn't look like they're coming out today. Hard luck.
Pokemon Snap, gotta catch them.
Are you actually kidding me? You mean to tell me we're going to be in the Pokemon world, in 3D, watching Pokemon in their natural habitats and taking pictures of them? And we can actually interact with them? Shut up and take my money. This sounded like the ultimate Pokemon game. Finally, I could actually see the world I've been imagining in my head. Instead of looking at tiny Pokemon sprites on a Game Boy screen, I'd be traveling through forests, beaches, caves, and volcanoes, seeing these creatures actually living in the wild. I wasn't just going to be playing Pokemon anymore, I was going to be in Pokemon. So naturally, I picked up a copy. I raced home, I shoved it into the Nintendo 64 and fired it up, and within a very short amount of time, I realized something. This wasn't the Pokemon game I'd been expecting. Because despite looking like the ultimate Pokemon experience, I couldn't catch anything. I couldn't battle anything, I couldn't build a team, I couldn't even decide where I wanted to go. In fact, I was beginning to wonder if I was even playing Pokemon anymore. And that's what got me thinking. Was Pokemon Snap even a good Pokemon game? The idea of Nintendo 64 Pokemon game in full 3D made me giddy. This was everything I'd been hoping and dreaming about, because if you grew up with Pokemon in the late 90s, you already had this world living inside your head. Pokemon Red and Blue had built the world for us. They told us that these creatures were out there. They gave us the sprites, the little animations, the weird sounds, the Pokédex entries, the towns, the caves, the forests, and the oceans. But ultimately, we were looking at it all through a tiny Game Boy screen. And now Nintendo was telling us, what if you could actually see it? What if you could see what these Pokemon looked like in the wild? What they were doing when they weren't battling? How they interacted with each other? What their habitats actually looked like? And better yet, what if you could get right up next to them and take a photograph? That sounds incredible. And that's what made the idea behind Pokemon Snap so brilliant. It wasn't trying to recreate Pokemon Red and Blue, it was taking one of the most fascinating parts of Pokemon, the Pokemon themselves, and giving us the chance to actually observe them. The commercial only made it look even better. We're seeing Pokemon everywhere, Pikachu running around, Butterfree flying through the air, Lapras swimming in the ocean, Charizard hanging around a volcano. And we're not just watching them, we're interacting with them. We can throw apples at them, we can use an item to change their behavior, we can lure them into different positions, and then, when we get the perfect opportunity, click. We've got a photo. It felt like the ultimate Pokemon fantasy. The Game Boy game had made us want to catch them all. Pokemon Snap was going to let us see them all. And because this was on the Nintendo 64, there weren't tiny sprites anymore. They were actual 3D Pokemon living inside the environments. For a kid in the late 90s, this was mind-blowing. I spent years imagining what these Pokemon actually looked like when they weren't standing in a battle screen waiting for me to select Tackle. Now I was going to find out. And this wasn't just going to be a one and done experience either. At least that's what I thought, because the concept seemed to have replayability coming out the wazoo. You'd go through an area, you'd take a bunch of photos, you'd come back and realize you completely missed something. Maybe there was a Pokemon hiding in the background, maybe you could interact with one differently, maybe you discovered a secret path, maybe you could get a better photograph, and then you'd go back and try again. It was simple gameplay loop. Explore, discover Pokemon, photograph them, improve your photos, unlock new areas, discover more Pokemon. And then, just do it all over again. Wash, rinse, repeat. And honestly, that sounded like a pretty good formula. It was the same basic philosophy that made Pokemon so addictive in the first place. Explore, discover, collect, come back, find something new, and do it all again. Only now, instead of trying to catch Pokemon and add them to your team, you'd be building a collection of photographs. And the concept clearly worked. Pokemon Snap went on to sell 3.5 million copies worldwide, making it one of the better selling games on the Nintendo 64. There was even something incredibly cool about what Nintendo did with those photographs. You could take your pictures to Blockbuster and actually have them printed out as physical stickers. So these weren't just photographs sitting on your Nintendo 64. You could take your digital Pokemon pictures, turn them into something you could actually hold. For kids who were already obsessed with Pokemon cards, toys, magazines, and basically anything else with Pikachu slapped on it, this was genius. Pokemon was suddenly becoming something you could collect, play, watch, and now photograph. Everything about this sounds perfect. And I think that's what makes Pokemon Snap so interesting looking back at it today. Because the idea itself, it's brilliant. It's simple. It's incredibly appealing. And it fits into a Pokemon universe perfectly. So there was nothing left for me to do other than grab the controller, fire up the Nintendo 64, and finally enter the world I'd been dreaming about. I was ready. Professor Oak was waiting, Pikachu was waiting, and I was ready to get the perfect shot. All I had to do was ask one very important question. Pikachu, are you ready for your close-up? Now is the moment of truth. I slammed the cartridge into the Nintendo 64, trembling with anticipation, practically overflowing with excitement, and then the excitement turns to confusion. Confusion turns to frustration. Frustration leads to anger.
Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
Because the more I played Pokemon Snap, the more I started to realize something. This wasn't really the Pokemon game I'd been expecting. And the problem wasn't that Pokemon Snap was badly made, quite the opposite. The problem was that everything I'd come to love about Pokemon seemed to have been stripped away. Because what makes Pokemon special? Discovery, exploration, choice, and experimentation. The feeling that you're in control of your own adventure. And the first thing Pokemon Snap takes away from you is probably the most obvious one. Control. In Pokemon, you're the one exploring the world. You decide where you're going. You can wander through the forest, take the wrong turn, find hidden items, stumble across a new Pokemon, or spend 20 minutes walking through tall grass because apparently That's what passes for entertainment when you're 11 years old. Pokemon Snap? Well, the world explores you. You're literally put on rails and dragged through the level at a predetermined pace. You don't decide when to move. You don't decide where to go. You don't even decide when the ride stops. You're basically being pushed around in a giant baby stroller operated by Daddy Professor Oak. Pokemon Red and Blue gave you the impression that you were going on an adventure. Snap gives you the impression that you've been booked on a guided tour. And I get why they did it. This is a photography game. If you're trying to photograph Pokemon, having them appear at specific points makes sense. You need to be able to design encounters. You need to know where Pikachu is going to appear. You need to know when the Diglets are going to pop up. You need to know where Magikarp is going to jump out of the water. From a game design perspective, it works. But from the perspective of someone expecting a Pokemon adventure, it's incredibly restrictive. And that restriction continues with the Pokemon themselves. Because one of the biggest appeals of Pokemon was always finding them. You could go into a new area and wonder what was hiding in the grass. Maybe you'd find a Pikachu. Maybe you'd find a new Pokemon you'd never seen before. Maybe you'd find something incredibly rare, and once you found it, you could catch it. It could be yours. It could be added to your team. You could train it. You could evolve it. You could build your entire team around that Pokemon. Pokemon Snap doesn't really give you that choice. The game decides which Pokemon you are going to see. Pokemon Red and Blue gave us 151 Pokemon to discover, whereas Pokemon Snap gives us just 63. Now, I'm not saying every Pokemon needed to be included. Obviously, the N64 would have struggled to render 151 fully 3D Pokemon. But when the entire premise of Pokemon is essentially gotta catch them all, it feels a little strange when the game doesn't even give you that opportunity to see most of them. And that's where I started to realize that I wasn't really collecting Pokemon anymore. I was collecting photographs of Pokemon. And there's an important distinction there. In the main game, you're building a team. You're making decisions. Do I keep my starter? Do I replace it with something stronger? Do I train this Pokemon? Do I evolve it? Which moves should I teach it? Do I want 6 absolute monsters that could flatten the Elite Four? Or do I want to build a completely ridiculous team around a Pokemon that I like for no other reason whatsoever? That's part of what makes Pokemon so personal. Everyone's adventure can be slightly different. You might have a Charizard that's ridiculously overpowered because you spent 3 hours grinding levels in one patch of grass. Someone else might have completely ignored the starters and built a team around a Pokemon they found later, like a Pidgey or a Weedle. And that's fine. It's your adventure. Pokemon Snap doesn't really have that. You're not becoming a Pokemon master. You're becoming David Attenborough with an N64 controller. The replayability isn't really there either. It's a game that takes you by the hand and drags you to the finish. In fact, there's a lot of levels in the game you can complete without doing much at all, if you just keep your hands off your joystick and tap the button.
That's what she said. Or he said.
The challenge isn't becoming a better Pokemon trainer, it's becoming a better photographer. And that can be fun. Actually, it's often really satisfying. There's something genuinely rewarding about finally getting the perfect shot of a Pokemon you've been trying to photograph. But that's also the problem. The thing I'd loved about Pokemon weren't really there. I didn't care about getting the perfect photograph of a Magikarp. I wanted to catch the thing, and suddenly I realized something. Pokemon Snap wasn't a Pokemon game with photography. It was a photography auto-scroller that just happened to have Pokemon. So, is Pokemon Snap a bad game? No, not at all. And I think that's the important distinction. Pokemon Snap is a good game. It's unique, it's charming, it looks fantastic for the time, and there really wasn't anything else quite like it for the Nintendo 64. Nintendo took the Pokemon world and turned it into a photography game, and honestly, they did a pretty good job. I mean, Mario was off playing golf and tennis, why can't Pokemon be in photography? You could take the photographs you spent all that time trying to get, pick your favourites out, go to Blockbuster and actually have them printed out. For a kid that was already obsessed with Pokemon, that was an incredible feature. And when you judge Pokemon Snap on what it actually is, a photography game starring Pokemon, it works. The environments are fun, the Pokemon animations are fantastic, the little interactions are genuinely clever, and getting that perfect photograph can be surprisingly satisfying. But that's also why I don't think it's a particularly good Pokemon game. But when I think about what makes a Pokemon game special, I think about the freedom, exploring, building a team, finding rare Pokemon, training them, evolving them, experimenting with moves, and most importantly, creating your own adventure. Pokemon Snap doesn't really give you that. It gives you a beautiful world to look at, but very little freedom to actually explore it. And I think that's why so many of us remember it more fondly than we remember actually playing it. We remember seeing Pokemon in 3D for the first time. We remember Pikachu running around. We remember throwing apples at Pokemon, trying to get the perfect picture. That feeling of being a kid and thinking, you're actually there. And that feeling was real. I'm not taking that away from anyone. I felt it too, but nostalgia is a hell of a drug and can make us remember how a game felt more than how it actually played. And when I put the nostalgia aside and look at Pokemon Snap for what it really is, I think it's much easier to appreciate it. It's a good, unique photography game. It just isn't the Pokemon adventure I wanted it to be. And maybe that's the strange thing about Pokemon Snap. The Game Boy games made us want to become Pokemon trainers. Pokemon Snap made us want to take pictures of Pokemon. And for me, those aren't quite the same thing. Pokemon Snap was a great way to see the Pokemon world. I just wish it had given me a little more freedom to actually live in it.